They found her in two pieces, not torn, not ripped, surgically separated. Her body laid out like a mannequin in a vacant lot, posed with such deliberate care that the first person to see her thought it was a department store dummy someone had discarded. But then she noticed the grass beneath was stained black. January 15th, 1947. A mother walking her child through the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles stumbled upon what would become the most haunting unsolved murder in American history. The woman's scream echoed through the morning fog, a sound that would reverberate through decades. What she'd found wasn't just a body. It was a message, a performance, a statement so disturbing that even hardened homicide detectives would turn away and vomit into the weeds. Her name was Elizabeth Short, 22 years old. Black hair, porcelain skin, dreams bigger than the Hollywood sign that watched over the city where she'd come to reinvent herself. But the world wouldn't remember her dreams. They'd remember her death. They'd remember the nickname the newspapers gave her, a name that would become synonymous with horror, with mystery, with the dark underbelly of the City of Angels, the Black Dahlia. And what was done to her body would suggest something beyond rage, beyond passion, beyond even madness. It suggested knowledge, medical precision, time. Whoever killed Elizabeth Short didn't just murder her. They performed on her. They had hours alone with her body after death. They drained every drop of blood from her corpse. They bisected her at the waist with such surgical accuracy that investigators immediately suspected the killer had anatomical training. And then, in an act of theatrical cruelty that still makes no sense 78 years later, they washed her, scrubbed her clean, positioned her in the grass with her arms raised above her head and her legs spread apart, creating a grotesque tableau that the first officers on scene described as looking almost peaceful from a distance. Almost artistic, until you got close enough to see her mouth. The cuts extended from the corners of her lips toward her ears, creating what would later be called a Glasgow smile. Carved deep while she was still alive, forcing her face into a permanent, nightmarish grin. But that wasn't the worst of it. The killer had done other things. Things the police reports would describe in clinical language to distance themselves from the horror. Rope marks on her wrists and ankles suggested she'd been bound. Bruising indicated she'd been suspended upside down. Cigarette burns dotted her skin in deliberate patterns. And the cause of death, when the coroner finally made his determination, wasn't from being cut in half. That happened after. Elizabeth Short had been beaten to death over the course of hours, maybe days, suffering through a prolonged torture session that left virtually no part of her body unmarked. Detective Harry Hansen caught the case, a 25-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department who'd seen everything the city could produce. Gang executions, domestic murders, crimes of passion and crimes of profit. But when he arrived at the vacant lot on Norton Avenue that morning and saw what had been done to Elizabeth Short, something inside him fundamentally changed. He would work the case obsessively for the next decade, following thousands of leads, interviewing hundreds of suspects, and never making a single arrest. It would consume him, destroy his marriage, drive him to drink, and when he finally retired in 1957, he told his captain that the Black Dahlia case was the only failure that kept him awake at night. The only victim whose voice he could still hear asking why. Why her? Why so much suffering? Why had no one been punished? But to understand why Elizabeth Short became the Black Dahlia, you have to understand who she was before that January morning, before the headlines, before the photographs of her bisected body were leaked to the press and splashed across front pages nationwide, before her death became entertainment. Elizabeth Ann Short was born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, on July 29, 1924. The third of 5 daughters in a family struggling through the Great Depression. Her father, Cleo Short, worked as a miniature golf course designer, a profession that became obsolete almost overnight when the economy collapsed. In 1929, when Elizabeth was just 5 years old, her father parked his car on a bridge in Charleston, left his coat and a note suggesting suicide, and disappeared. The family assumed he was dead. They mourned him. They moved on with their lives, Phoebe Short raising 5 girls alone, taking in laundry and sewing work to keep food on the table. But Cleo wasn't dead. He'd faked his suicide and fled to California, starting a new life without the burden of a wife and 5 daughters. Elizabeth grew up believing her father was a tragic figure who'd been defeated by circumstances. A man who'd loved them so much that losing them was preferable to watching them starve. It would be years before she learned the truth. Years before a letter arrived from California, her father explaining that he'd been alive all along, that he'd simply left. The betrayal would shape her in ways she'd never fully articulate. It would send her west, chasing the ghost of the man who'd abandoned her, looking for something she couldn't quite name. Closure, maybe, or revenge, or simply proof that she was worth staying for. But Elizabeth had other reasons for leaving Massachusetts. She'd been a sickly child, suffering from chronic asthma and bronchitis that left her pale and weak through the brutal New England winters. Doctors recommended she move to a warmer climate. Her mother agreed, scraping together enough money to send her teenage daughter to Miami, Florida, where she'd stay with family friends. It was supposed to be temporary, a medical necessity. But Elizabeth never came back. Not really. By 16, she'd discovered something that would become both her greatest asset and her fatal flaw. She was beautiful, strikingly, memorably beautiful in a way that made people stop and stare. Men, especially. Elizabeth learned early that her appearance was currency, that it could get her things, meals, drinks, rides, attention. She had pale skin that she kept meticulously powdered, dark hair she wore in the fashionable styles of the day, and blue eyes that photographs captured with an almost haunting quality. She dressed exclusively in black, partly because she was in perpetual mourning for her father, who she still believed was dead, partly because it made her stand out in an era of pastels and floral prints. Friends from her teenage years remember her as sweet but elusive. She'd show up at parties, be the center of attention for an hour, then vanish without explanation. She collected admirers, but never seemed to let any of them get close. There was something performative about her, they said, like she was always aware of being watched, always conscious of the character she was playing. By 1943, Elizabeth had made her way to California. Not to find her father initially, she didn't know he was alive yet, but to chase the dream that pulled thousands of young women west every year. Hollywood, stardom, a name in lights. She had no training, no connections, no realistic plan. But she had that face, and she'd been told by enough men in enough bars that she could be in pictures, that she had a quality, a presence, something the camera would love. So she came to Los Angeles with a suitcase and a fantasy, joining the massive wave of aspiring actresses who waited tables and lived in boarding houses and showed up to open casting calls by the hundreds. But Elizabeth's Hollywood dream died almost as quickly as it began. The studios weren't interested. The agents who promised to make calls never did. The photographers who offered to shoot her portfolio wanted payment she couldn't provide, or payment of a different kind that she wouldn't provide. She bounced between jobs, working briefly as a waitress, a movie theater usher, a clerk at the PX on the army base, where soldiers returning from World War II would gather. And this is where Elizabeth found her real talent, not acting, but being the thing these men needed her to be. She became what we'd now call a V-girl, a victory girl. Young women who hung around military bases and USO dances, offering companionship to servicemen. Sometimes just conversation, sometimes dancing, sometimes more, though multiple men who dated Elizabeth Short would later tell investigators that she never went all the way. That she was flirtatious, affectionate, even passionate, but that there was a line she wouldn't cross. Some theorized she was frigid, others suggested trauma. A few noted that her asthma and chronic health problems might have left her with internal scarring that made sex painful or impossible. But Elizabeth herself never explained. She simply collected soldiers the way other women collected stamps, writing letters to dozens of them, promising each one that he was special, that when the war ended they'd be together. Then she got a letter that changed everything. Her father was alive. Living in Vallejo, California, working at a naval base, the man she'd mourned, the tragic figure whose death had shaped her entire adolescence, had simply been in California the whole time building a new life. The betrayal must have been staggering. But Elizabeth did something strange. She went to him, showed up at his door in 1946, and moved into his small apartment. Maybe she wanted answers. Maybe she wanted to punish him by forcing him to confront what he'd abandoned. Or maybe, like so many children of absent parents, she simply wanted him to finally see her, to recognize her worth. It lasted 3 weeks. Cleo Short later told police that his daughter was lazy, that she slept all day and went out all night, that she brought men around and drank his liquor and showed no interest in getting a real job. But friends who knew Elizabeth told a different story. They said Cleo was cruel to her, mocking her dreams, belittling her appearance, making it clear that the family he'd built in California, the life he'd constructed after his fake suicide, had no room for the daughter he'd left behind. After 3 weeks of escalating arguments, Cleo kicked her out, told her to get out of his apartment and never come back. And Elizabeth, heartbroken and homeless, returned to Los Angeles with nowhere to go. The last 6 months of Elizabeth Short's life are a patchwork of incomplete memories and contradictory accounts. She was staying with friends, then with acquaintances, then with people who barely knew her. She'd show up at someone's door late at night with a suitcase, charming and apologetic, explaining she just needed a place for a few days. Those few days would stretch into weeks. She'd use their phone to make long-distance calls, eat their food, borrow their clothes. And then, without warning, she'd be gone. No note. No goodbye. Just an empty room and the faint smell of her perfume. People remember her as a phantom during this period, there but not there, smiling but sad, always talking about the big break that was coming, the screen test that was scheduled, the producer who'd taken an interest in her. But none of it was real. By December 1946, Elizabeth was essentially homeless. She'd burned through most of her friendships. The few people still willing to take her in did so out of pity rather than affection. She was working sporadically, but spending what little money she earned on clothes and makeup and the maintenance of the image she'd created. Because that's what Elizabeth had become. An image. A carefully constructed facade of glamour and mystery that required constant upkeep. The black dresses, the perfect hair, the red lipstick. Take away the costume and there wasn't much underneath. Just a sick girl from Massachusetts who'd been abandoned by her father and was slowly realizing that Hollywood didn't want her. But Elizabeth had one skill that kept her afloat. She knew how to meet men, how to make them feel special, how to extract dinner and drinks and small loans without ever quite promising anything in return. In her final weeks, she was seen at bars all over Los Angeles, the Biltmore Hotel downtown, the Hideaway on Sunset, small cocktail lounges where servicemen and salesmen would buy drinks for a pretty girl with a sad story. And Elizabeth always had a sad story. About her father, who'd died when she was young. About her fiancé who'd been killed in the war. About the screen test that fell through. About the luggage that had been stolen. The stories changed depending on the audience, but the effect was the same. Men wanted to rescue her, or at least to be the one who finally made her happy. January 9th, 1947. Elizabeth Short was seen at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Multiple witnesses place her in the lobby around 6:30 in the evening. She was wearing black as always, carrying her suitcase, and appeared to be waiting for someone. A clerk remembers her using the house phone to make a call. She seemed agitated, he said, nervous. She kept looking toward the entrance like she was expecting someone who wasn't showing up. Then, around 7 p.m., she was seen walking toward the main entrance. And after that, Elizabeth Short vanished. For 6 days, no confirmed sighting, no phone calls to friends, no appearances at the places she usually frequented. Just silence, until that morning in the vacant lot, when a mother walking her child found what was left of her. The investigation began immediately, and it was chaos from the start. The Los Angeles Police Department was overwhelmed. The press was relentless. Reporters from every newspaper in the city descended on the crime scene, contaminating evidence and interviewing witnesses before police could secure the area. Photographs of Elizabeth's bisected body were somehow leaked to the press within hours, appearing in afternoon editions before her family had even been notified. The nickname, Black Dahlia, was coined by a reporter who'd heard that Elizabeth wore black clothing and frequented a drugstore where servicemen had called her the Black Dahlia, a reference to a film noir called The Blue Dahlia that had been released the previous year. The name stuck, and within days, Elizabeth Short, the person, had been erased, replaced by the Black Dahlia. A mystery, a symbol, a story that sold newspapers. The police had almost nothing to work with. No murder weapon, no crime scene. The body had clearly been killed elsewhere and dumped in the lot. No identification initially, until fingerprints matched Elizabeth to an arrest for underage drinking years earlier. But what they did have was a body that told a story. The cuts were too precise to be random. The bisection at the waist suggested someone with medical or butcher training. The drainage of blood indicated a location with running water and time, hours at minimum, maybe days, and the posing suggested a killer who wanted the body found, who wanted the horror seen. This wasn't about hiding a crime, it was about displaying it. Then the letters started arriving. 3 days after Elizabeth's body was discovered, an envelope was delivered to the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper. Inside was Elizabeth's social security card, her birth certificate, photographs of her with various men, and an address book with dozens of names and phone numbers. The pages had been soaked in gasoline, probably to destroy fingerprints, but the contents were still readable. There was no note, no explanation, just Elizabeth's personal effects, sent by someone who clearly had them because they'd killed her. The package was postmarked from downtown Los Angeles. The police traced every name in that address book, hundreds of interviews, dozens of suspects, and every single one had an alibi or a reason they couldn't have done it. But the killer wasn't finished communicating. More letters arrived at the newspaper over the following weeks, some with messages cut from magazine letters, pasted together ransom note style. Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow. Another said, I will give myself up in 10 days. I could not help myself for this. Sorry, Mary. The Mary reference was never explained. Was it the killer's name? Someone they were apologizing to? A red herring to confuse investigators? The letters continued sporadically for months, each one analyzed by handwriting experts, each one traced by postal inspectors, and every single one led nowhere. The police were drowning in leads. Tips came in by the thousands, people reporting suspicious neighbors, ex-boyfriends, strangers who looked wrong. The LAPD followed every single one, and the investigation expanded to include over 500 officers. They interviewed more than 150 suspects. They took confessions from dozens of people, men and women, who walked into police stations claiming they'd killed the Black Dahlia. But every confession fell apart under scrutiny. Details that didn't match, alibis that checked out, mental illness that explained the false admission. By March of 1947, 2 months after Elizabeth's murder, the police had no viable suspects and no clear direction. The case was going cold and everyone knew it. But one suspect kept surfacing. A name that appeared in multiple witness statements in Elizabeth's address book in the background of her final weeks. Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician. Tall, handsome, intellectually brilliant, and by all accounts, deeply disturbing. Hodel ran a clinic downtown, but was better known for throwing parties at his mansion in the Hollywood Hills. Parties where artists and writers and actors would gather, where the alcohol flowed freely and the boundaries between acceptable and taboo would blur. Hodel had a reputation for sleeping with his patients, for performing illegal abortions, for having a sexual appetite that made even his bohemian friends uncomfortable, and multiple witnesses claimed to have seen Elizabeth Short at his house in the weeks before her death. But George Hodel was connected. He had friends in the police department, friends in the district attorney's office, friends in the mayor's office. When investigators tried to pursue him as a suspect, they were quietly told to back off. That Hodel was off limits. That pursuing a man of his prominence without rock-solid evidence would be career suicide. So they watched him instead. In 1950, 3 years after Elizabeth's murder, the LAPD got approval to bug Hodel's house. They planted microphones in multiple rooms and listened to his conversations for several weeks. And what they heard was disturbing. Hodel talking about the body in the lot. Hodel bragging that he was too smart for them. Hodel discussing techniques of avoiding detection, but never a clear confession, never anything that would hold up in court. Then something happened that made the investigation impossible. Hodel was arrested, but not for murder, for molesting his teenage daughter. Tamar Hodel came forward with allegations that her father had been abusing her for years, that he'd gotten her pregnant, that he'd forced her to have an abortion. The trial was sensational, front-page news for weeks. But Hodel had expensive lawyers, and they destroyed Tamar's credibility on the stand, portrayed her as a troubled teenager who'd made up stories for attention. The jury acquitted George Hodel of all charges, and he walked out of that courtroom a free man. Within weeks, he'd left the country, fled to the Philippines, then later to Asia, where he'd spend the rest of his life practicing medicine and, according to later accounts, continuing his predatory behavior. The Black Dahlia case officially went cold in 1952. Detective Hansen kept the file open on his desk, kept following leads that went nowhere, but the department had moved on. Other murders, other cases. Los Angeles was a violent city, and Elizabeth Short was just one victim among hundreds. But something about her death wouldn't let go. Maybe it was the brutality, maybe it was the mystery, or maybe it was the way her murder had been turned into entertainment. The photographs, the newspaper stories, the speculation about her sex life, her habits, her character. In death, Elizabeth had become the star she'd always wanted to be, but the role she was playing was victim, damaged goods. A cautionary tale about pretty girls who come to Hollywood with big dreams and no protection. The decades passed, and the Black Dahlia became myth. Books were written. Movies were made. Every few years, someone would come forward claiming to have solved the case. Claiming their grandfather was the killer, claiming they'd found new evidence, but none of it ever held up. In 2003, Steve Hodel, the son of George Hodel and brother of Tamar, published a book called Black Dahlia Avenger. In it, he laid out an exhaustive case that his father had murdered Elizabeth Short. He'd spent years researching, found the police transcripts from the bugged house, matched details of the crime to his father's medical knowledge and sadistic personality, connected other unsolved murders in Los Angeles to his father's timeline. The book was compelling, disturbing, and according to Steve Hodel, proof positive that George Hodel was the Black Dahlia killer. But the LAPD never officially confirmed it, never closed the case based on Steve Hodel's evidence. They acknowledged that George Hodel had been a suspect, that the bugged conversations were suggestive. But without a confession, without physical evidence, without a living suspect to charge, what was the point? Elizabeth Short was dead 78 years ago. Everyone who knew her was dead. Everyone who worked the original case was dead. The killer, whoever he was certainly dead. Justice wasn't possible. The best anyone could offer was a theory, a likely explanation, but not certainty. Never certainty. So why does the Black Dahlia case still haunt us? Why, almost 8 decades later, does Elizabeth Short's murder continue to generate books and documentaries and endless speculation? It's not because the crime was unique. Los Angeles has seen worse murders, more brutal killings, more innocent victims. But something about this case captured the cultural imagination in a way that refuses to let go. Maybe it's the Hollywood angle. The idea that a girl could come to the city of dreams and end up bisected in a vacant lot. There's a dark poetry to it, a warning about the price of ambition, about the dangers that lurk beneath the glamorous surface. Or maybe it's the mystery itself. We're uncomfortable with unsolved crimes. They violate our need for narrative closure. Someone does something evil, they must be caught and punished. That's how stories are supposed to end. But Elizabeth's story doesn't end, it just stops. And that incompleteness gnaws at us. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe we're drawn to the Black Dahlia case because it allows us to project our own fears and obsessions onto it. Depending on who's telling the story, Elizabeth is either a tragic innocent destroyed by Hollywood's corruption or a manipulative grifter who got involved with the wrong person. She's either a victim of male violence and a misogynistic society, or a cautionary tale about women who use their sexuality as currency. The truth is, probably somewhere in the middle, and probably much more mundane. Elizabeth Short was a troubled young woman with limited options, trying to survive in a city that chews up and spits out thousands of people just like her. She made some bad decisions. She trusted the wrong person. And she died horribly because of it. That's not poetic. It's not mysterious. It's just sad. But we don't want sad. We want meaning. We want Elizabeth's death to reveal something profound about the human condition, or about the dark heart of Hollywood, or about the nature of evil. We want her killer to be a mastermind, a monster, someone whose crimes were so elaborate and carefully planned that it makes sense why he was never caught. The alternative, that her murderer was just a violent nobody who got lucky, who killed her in a moment of rage and disposed of the body with enough basic precaution to avoid detection, that's too random, too senseless. We need the Black Dahlia to be special, because if she's not, then she's just another murdered girl in a city full of murdered girls, and there's no story there. Just tragedy. Let's talk about what probably happened. Strip away the myth and the speculation and the conspiracy theories about powerful men and satanic cults and serial killers. Based on the evidence, based on what we actually know, rather than what we imagine, here's the likely truth. Elizabeth Short spent her last night alive with someone she knew. Maybe not well, but well enough to get in a car with them. Well enough to go to their place. The Biltmore Hotel sighting on January 9th suggests she was waiting to meet someone. That phone call she made in the lobby was probably to confirm the meeting. When she walked out of that hotel around 7 p.m., she walked toward her death. But she went willingly. There was no struggle, no sign she was forced. Whoever she was with took her somewhere private, a house or a basement or a garage, somewhere with water access and soundproofing, and over the next several hours, maybe longer, they tortured her, beat her, burned her with cigarettes, carved her face, strung her up by her ankles. Whether this was sexual or something else is impossible to know. The absence of sexual assault, the lack of semen or evidence of rape, suggests the violence itself was the point. The killer wasn't interested in sex with Elizabeth. They were interested in destroying her, slowly, methodically, with surgical precision. And when she finally died, probably from the repeated blows to her head, they kept working. Drained her blood in a bathtub, bisected her body, washed her clean, and then, for reasons we'll never understand, posed her in that vacant lot like an art installation. A message, a display. Look what I can do, look what I did to this beautiful girl, look and be afraid. Then they sent her belongings to the newspaper because they wanted credit. They wanted the world to know this wasn't random, this was personal, this was planned. But as the investigation intensified, as the police presence grew overwhelming, the killer got scared. Those later letters, the ones promising to turn themselves in, those read like someone panicking. Someone who'd expected to feel powerful, but instead felt hunted. And eventually, they stopped sending letters, stopped communicating. Disappeared back into normal life and never killed again. Or never killed in a way that attracted attention. The tragedy of Elizabeth Short isn't just that she died horribly. It's that her death overshadowed her life so completely that we barely remember she was a person. We know more about what was done to her body than we do about who she actually was. What made her laugh, what she wanted beyond the vague dream of stardom, what she thought about late at night when she was alone. We know she wrote letters to soldiers. We know she was kind to children. We know she sent money home to her mother when she could afford it, which wasn't often. We know she had a sense of humor, that friends remember her making jokes about her situation, about being between residences when she was actually homeless. We know she was resilient, that despite everything, despite her father's abandonment and Hollywood's rejection and the fact that she was sleeping on different couches every week, she kept trying, kept putting on the black dress and the red lipstick and going out into the world like she believed something good was still possible. And maybe that's the real horror of the Black Dahlia case. Not the gore, not the mystery, but the erasure. Elizabeth Short became a thing, a symbol, a plot point in a story about murder and mayhem. Her body was photographed. Her corpse was studied. Her personal life was dissected by reporters who spread rumors that she was a prostitute, that she was promiscuous, that she'd somehow invited her own murder through reckless behavior. None of it was true, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story. And the story required Elizabeth to be a certain type of victim, young, beautiful, tragic. morally ambiguous enough that readers could feel simultaneously sympathetic and superior. She was like us, but she made mistakes we'd never make. She was a cautionary tale we could consume without confronting our own vulnerability. Because here's what we don't want to admit. Elizabeth Short wasn't special. Her murder wasn't unique. Women are killed by men all the time, and most of those murders are never solved. Most of those women never get their names in the paper, never become legends. They just die, and the world moves on. Elizabeth is only famous because her death was theatrical enough to capture attention. Because the photographs were grotesque. Because the nickname was catchy. But underneath all that, she's just another victim of male violence. Another woman who trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. And we've turned her suffering into entertainment. So where does that leave us? 78 years later, the Black Dahlia case remains unsolved, and it will almost certainly stay that way forever. Everyone directly connected to the crime is dead. The physical evidence, what little there was, has been lost or degraded beyond usefulness. DNA testing on the body isn't possible because Elizabeth was buried decades before DNA technology existed. The letters sent to the newspaper were handled by so many people that any genetic material is hopelessly contaminated. We have theories. We have suspects. We have educated guesses based on incomplete information. But we don't have answers. We don't have justice. We just have a story that refuses to end because we refuse to let it end. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe the fact that the Black Dahlia case remains unsolved is a kind of honesty. It acknowledges that sometimes evil wins, sometimes monsters walk free, sometimes bad things happen to innocent people and nobody is ever punished. That's not the ending we want, but it's the ending we got. And continuing to obsess over Elizabeth Short's murder, continuing to write books and make documentaries and speculate about suspects, that's not about solving a crime. It's about processing our own discomfort with randomness. With the fact that any of us could be walking through the Biltmore Hotel on an ordinary evening, waiting to meet someone we think we know, and 6 days later be found in pieces in a vacant lot. That's the real horror. Not that someone could be evil enough to do what was done to Elizabeth, but that we could be unlucky enough to encounter that person. That we could die not because we did anything wrong, but simply because we were there. Because we were vulnerable, because we were seen by someone who wanted to destroy beauty rather than create it. Elizabeth Short wanted to be remembered. She came to Hollywood dreaming of immortality, of seeing her face on movie screens, of being someone whose name would live forever. And in a twisted way, she got that. She's more famous now than she ever could have become as an actress. But this isn't the fame she wanted. This is the fame of being a victim, of being a warning, of being the girl whose story parents tell their daughters when they talk about the dangers of the world. Be careful. Don't trust strangers. Don't get in that car. Or you'll end up like the Black Dahlia. In the end, the Black Dahlia murder tells us more about ourselves than it does about Elizabeth Short or her killer. It reveals our obsession with female victimhood, our need to find meaning in senseless violence, our discomfort with unsolved mysteries, our tendency to turn real tragedy into myth and entertainment. Elizabeth Short was a real person who lived a real life and died a real death. But we've turned her into a symbol, a ghost story, a puzzle to be solved. And in doing so, we've done to her memory what her killer did to her body. We've cut her into pieces, arranged those pieces to serve our purposes, made her into something she never asked to be. If we really wanted to honor Elizabeth Short, we'd stop calling her the Black Dahlia. We'd use her real name. We'd talk about her life instead of just her death. We'd acknowledge that she was more than the sum of what was done to her in those final hours. She was a daughter who loved her mother, a sister who wrote letters home, a friend who made people laugh, a dreamer who believed in possibilities even when every door was closing. She was complicated and flawed and trying her best in a world that wasn't particularly kind to girls like her. And she deserved better than what she got. She deserved better than to die in pieces in a vacant lot. She deserved better than to have her personal belongings sent to a newspaper like a taunt. She deserved better than to have her name forgotten and replaced with a nickname created by the press. She deserved better than to become a mystery instead of being remembered as a person. But this is what we do. We transform victims into stories, because stories are easier to process than reality. Stories have structure. They have heroes and villains and plot twists, and eventually, usually, they have resolution. Reality is messier. Reality is a 22-year-old girl who got in the wrong car on a January evening and was never seen alive again. Reality is a killer who probably lived a normal life afterward, who maybe felt guilt or maybe felt nothing, who took their secret to the grave. Reality is a case file in a Los Angeles police storage facility that will never be closed. And reality is all of us, decades later, still talking about the Black Dahlia. Still trying to solve a mystery that maybe doesn't need solving. Still trying to find meaning in a meaningless act of violence. Still using Elizabeth Short's suffering as entertainment, as a cautionary tale, as a story to tell in the dark. She's been dead for 78 years. When do we finally let her rest?